We all know what perfectionism is. I've dodged the topic for a while now, only hinting at it from time to time. We all know we shouldn't give in, and yet it remains perhaps the most pervasive issue artists encounter, to this day. Understanding what causes perfectionism for you personally is perhaps the best place to start, so let's get straight into it. First of all, what is perfectionism? Very simply, it is the pursuit of perfection, either in life in general or in a particular field. In this case, it is the pursuit of flawlessness in your art. It often takes the form of very high and very specific expectations for oneself. This can become apparent when people give positive feedback, but it doesn't matter because it does not address the specific area that you focused on. It is also worth recognizing that artists don't always take this perfection literally. Perfectionism can also take the form of, my art is never good enough. This response comes from the same place, however, and from the same incredible expectations. In this episode, we are going to look at potential places your perfectionism may have come from, and then ways to fight back at perfectionism, put it in its place, or tame it into a tool for your benefit. Where does it come from then? Some people may be born with this trait, or at least predisposed toward it, though I would reckon most of us grow into it from particular circumstances in our lives. As we begin to explore potential causes or stimuli, you may be able to start imagining what we can do to fight each of the diabolical tendrils that it sends into our lives. We're going to start with perfectionism in general, and then move into perfectionism from an artistic perspective. High and specific expectations set for you in the past can lead to a perfectionistic tendency. Often, for most people, this starts with your parents. Now, just to start off on the right note, I am a parent. I have a good relationship with my parents. In some ways, my parents were the full encouragement that I needed to start artistic exploration in my youth. My dad, coming back from his military exploits across the globe, he brought drawings and paintings back to me, and it was one of the things that encouraged me to get into art in the first place. So I'm not going to rag on parents or pin perfectionism on them solely. But the reality is, for many, many people, the way that parents handle certain situations, expectations, and exploits by their children encourages perfectionistic tendencies. If praise for a child is only given when they attain things, then the lesson there is essentially, you are fulfilling my desires and expectations for you when you attain things, and you're likely not going to get that praise and adoration in other venues. Now, there are psychologically advanced or mature children who can understand that dichotomy, but young children often simply look at that and go, if I want my parents' affection, if I want my parents' encouragement or support, I have to achieve. And those expectations are often not given to every student or child in the family in a similar way. All of the kids are different after all, and so you end up with weird situations where this student or this kid is not particularly academically gifted, and so they get the encouragement for lesser standards than this other student or child does. And that can be frustrating, and it can breed a need in a young kid to achieve astronomically high things in order to, from their limited childhood experience, earn their parents' affection. There are very few parents out there that actually take things on this way. Very, very few parents that I ran across in the thousands of parents that I interacted with over my tenure teaching actually only valued their kids' achievements. When it did happen, it felt a little bit like I was running into a Disney villain. But most of the time, these parents meant really well, and they just had unfortunately and accidentally taught their kids that the way to earn affection was by achievement, was by these things that these students took care of. So if you have perfectionistic tendencies, there's a really good chance that something in your childhood, something in how you were parented could have led to that. There's also a large section of the populace that did this to themselves. And this isn't assigning the blame in so much as it's trying to sift through the pieces and figure out where the cause comes from so that it can be worked through later. Some people build this up in themselves. They construct a reality for themselves where their self-worth is linked to their achievements and to achieving their own expectations. This is a little bit rarer when it's not also linked to parenting, but I ran into this several times where the parents were ridiculously encouraging and didn't really care what grades or achievements their kid got. And their kids still had this desire to achieve astronomically high things to teach themselves or show themselves that they were valuable. They had somehow wound up in a situation where they equated their own self-worth with their achievements and with achieving high expectation or having high expectations for themselves and then achieving those expectations. This was a little bit rarer, but not altogether uncommon. And often the parents were saddened by the state because they would try to take on some of that blame and be unable to affect it because it really wasn't theirs in the first place. They didn't necessarily create the situation. And sometimes this happens with oldest siblings where their younger siblings absorbed a large portion of their parents' work and attention when they were young. And so the oldest sibling sometimes puts this extra pressure on themselves, the desire and need to achieve things, to take care of the family, to be a good example for their younger siblings, or to just make mom and dad not worry. So it's kind of extricated from the parenting situation. It's linked maybe loosely. So if you find yourself tying your self-worth into your achievements, into your art achievements, into your grades, into getting a job, into getting a degree, then there's a good chance that this might be tied to perfectionism. And there's a good chance that it might be tied to your own developed perfectionism. It might be linked to your parents, it might be linked to some other components as well, but it's good to understand where these things come from. If you understand that it comes from your parents, there's different ways to mitigate that versus if it comes from you internally. Now, a third potential area this comes from is culture. And culture is a little bit more ethereal and ambiguous. It's more difficult to ascertain which parts of this are affecting you. There are many different cultures around the world where there is an immense amount of pressure put on the firstborn or the firstborn male of a family to take on a family business or to achieve certain things. Sometimes this comes in the form of this is the family business and you're going to take it over, or your mother did this and so the expectation is that you follow in her footsteps. Sometimes things like that can be pushed. There are different countries that push academics and achievements in different ways. I think these things come in waves. When I was growing up, it was considered a hindrance to the family legacy if you didn't go to college. That is starting to change in the United States now, where it's not frowned upon if your child goes and joins the trades and learns how to be a welder or a woodworker or a carpenter. These kind of things nowadays have a little bit more standing in American society. But when I was growing up, if you were the kid who wasn't going to college and you were going to go learn how to work on cars, your parents might have been hesitant to tell other people about those things. So that might be linked to your parents, obviously, but it's also a cultural thing. And there's probably far more of these than I'm aware of. I live in the middle of the United States, and I am ignorant to how many things function across the world, including the rest of the country that I reside in. So I wanted to have this section here because there are probably lots of other arenas and lots of other cultural implications that I am unaware of. But I do know that they exist. I do know that every culture, whether it's aware of it or not, has certain pressures that it puts on the young people. And so Colorado is starting to change. We have a huge need for people with trade skills. And so it's no longer looked at in quite the same way. That being said, this might be an extension of your family. So not your parents, but your extended family. I have some friends even recently that I've heard from them. Aunts, uncles, grandparents on either side have said some negative things about their pursuit of art or their pursuit of education or moving across the country for this school versus that school. Those I would assign as more cultural things. They're family, but it's broader, non-nucleic family. It's the people outside, and it's the rumors, and it's the people that you grew up with talking about things. So culture has impact, and it's difficult for me to lay out all of it here because, again, I've only been exposed to a set amount of cultures, the ones that I've grown up in, the ones that I've moved into, and I have this tiny little fleeting snapshot of all the countries that I've visited, and I wouldn't even begin to tell you that just because I've been to Iceland a couple times that I have any understanding of the cultural impact on perfectionism in Iceland. So if you are from anywhere other than central United States, please share in the comments below what some of these cultural perfectionistic tendencies or cultural pressures are for you. I'd love to hear about it, and I think other people would benefit from it as well. Another reason that perfectionism can manifest is that you are feeling out of control, and having things at a certain level of perfection allows you to maintain more control over your particular situation, over your life. Now, this was an interesting one, but makes a lot of sense. It's something that showed up when I started researching this topic and looking at psychology and psychiatry and some documents and articles written in those fields. But it makes a lot of sense. If there are a lot of elements in your life that you don't have much control over, it makes sense to apply control to the areas that you can. So if this is academics, if this is sports, or if this is your art, these are areas that you can focus intensely on. You can control to some degree your success and your failure. You can control how much time you put in them. You can control your proficiency. And if you don't have control in a lot of areas of your life, this can be a way for you to assert dominance over something, to have something that you can sink your claws and your teeth into and own. And this is really important if your life is a little bit chaotic. And so if there's a lot going on in your life, if you haven't had a whole lot of autonomy for decision making, then perfectionism can kind of rear up as a method of dealing with that. In my youth, we moved so many times that I had some struggles with feeling like I didn't have a home. I didn't know where home was. In fact, to this day, when people ask, where did you grow up? Like, where's home? Where are you from? I don't know how to answer. I had something like 20 different places I lived in the first couple years of my life. And so it's difficult. Now, for me, I didn't develop perfectionism as a coping mechanism for that. What I developed was a little bit of attachment issues. I want to know that the people in my life matter and that they're going to be consistent. And I also have a strange desire to stay home that persists today. Some of that is linked to my introversion, but there are other aspects of it that are just, I didn't have home for a long time that was secure, and so I really like being home. I like being in a place that is my castle, and I know where things are, and it's secure. But there have been a lot of people in my life, some that are very close to me, that their method of dealing with the chaos in their existence was to be perfectionistic. There are two people that come to mind right now that this was their method of dealing with the chaos of their life in some other way. Chaos might sound like too strong of a term, but it doesn't have to be that chaotic. It could literally be that you've got a sibling that pulls most of the parental energy. Part of how you can reclaim some control in your world is perfectionism. It can be that you feel like you're a burden, which is a terrible thing for a kid to feel, but it happens. And if you feel like you're a burden, you can remove some of that burden from yourself and potentially from the rest of your family by controlling everything you do to the highest degree possible. So perfectionism can arise from a need to have some control in a life that lacks control for you personally in a lot of other capacities. Let's move into art specifically then. Art-specific perfectionism. I think one of the first things that comes to mind as you start looking at why this might occur is the false notion that art can be perfect. Now, I mentioned earlier that this doesn't always literally manifest in my painting needs to be perfect, but it sometimes does, and it sometimes manifests in a manner of my art needs to be better than I'm capable of making it at this moment. So let's look at it with both of those pieces in mind, with the idea that art can be perfect, or with a misunderstanding of your art should be better than it's capable of being at this particular moment. So obviously art can't be perfect. There can always be one more mark that's put on a thing, and half the time it doesn't make it better, or worse, it just makes it different. There is a certain quality of a painting, like once you get past a certain point where it's difficult to ascertain if it's better or if it's just different than another piece. When you look at Van Gogh's work, when you look at Monet's work, they're not precise, but they achieve something more unique than a perfect painting of the same topic. After a certain level of proficiency is achieved, perfection is not the question. So there might be a false notion that art can be perfect, but there's also this other side where you think that your art should be higher level or higher quality than you are capable of producing. This is difficult because we can look at other artists, especially today. It's very easy to hop online and see other artists that are substantially better than you. And I think this is the case for all artists. I think every artist, regardless of their skill level, has people they look at and go, goodness, I'll never be as good as this guy. What am I doing with my life? We have to understand that sometimes that leads to our need to be more perfect, our desire to be better than we are. the desire to have expectations that are far higher than what is rationally achievable at the moment in which we exist. And this leads into the second point, which is the idea that you can make a perfect piece of art. So that's separate from the idea that art in general can be perfect. So think for a second, like when was the last time you saw a perfect piece of art? A piece that if you truly delved into, you would find no faults. Now, you might think this, but if you really get inside the head of the artist who created it, if you compare it to their other work, I think we would struggle to find any piece of art that we would say is perfect. I could look again at some of these paintings by Van Gogh and Monet and go, well, this is the perfect painting. But again, what does that word even mean when it comes to a piece of art? Now, I could say I painted this owl perfectly. Like, it looks exactly like the owl. That's measurable, that's understandable, and I would argue it's also totally pointless and irrelevant. The desire to be better, however, is totally understandable and something most of us as artists struggle with. I want to be substantially better than I am right now. I don't want to be perfect, nor do I struggle with the perception that I'm not as good as I think I should be. I want to be better, and I'm frustrated with the fact that I'm not. I'm impatient. I know what it's going to take to get better, but I'm impatient. So if this is you, if this is where it's coming from for you, that your desire is to make a perfect piece of art or to keep working on something until it's perfect, or you're not going to touch a piece of art until you understand the strategy to get there perfectly, just understand that that's where it comes from in you. And we'll get to some strategies on how to deal with this in a little bit. So another area is the desire to appear perfect. This is substantially different than thinking art can be perfect or trying to make a perfect piece of art. Sometimes it can be the desire to appear perfect. Sometimes this is for yourself. You are a vulnerable person. Maybe you struggle with vulnerability. Maybe you've got some trauma in your past and people have taken terrible advantage of you. And so you want to appear perfect so you don't stand out. So people don't bully you. So people don't mess with you or make fun of you in some capacity. Understandable. Maybe it's for someone else. Maybe you've got a younger sibling or you've got people in your life that look up to you and your desire is to appear perfect to them so that you don't let them down. This is tough because it's understandable. In some ways it's noble, but at the same time it can weigh so heavily on your psyche and on your soul if you are trying to maintain an image that is not necessarily realistic for the sake of someone else. There is something noble about it, but it also needs to be delved into and understood more deeply so it doesn't terribly negatively impact you. Another one here is the desire to appear perfect to ensure you have value. I touched on this earlier, and this is really dangerous, but if you need to appear perfect to other people because that's where you get your sense of worth, your sense of value, that is really dangerous. You can't control how you appear to other people, and therefore you've put your sense of self-worth and value into someone else's hands. And that's really, really dangerous because humans are fickle and we fluctuate constantly. And it's a terrifying idea that your self-worth could be bound up in someone else's perception. So again, this is not altogether uncommon. If this is you though, think about it deeply. Try to understand why your self-worth would come from another person, why you think it does, and really delve into that. And if it does turn out to be something that you need some help on, I would encourage you seek some therapy or some counseling in that capacity. It's very, very important. You are a human being. You have value innately. It is not tied to your success or your perfection. All right, on a lighter note, here's another reason why you can seek art-specific perfection or why the lack of perfection can be so frustrating for you. Maybe other things in your life have come really, really easily. So this one is something I see frequently. I have a student in my mind right now that most academic topics come for them incredibly easily. And so when they run into roadblocks, when they run into things that are difficult, it's very, very frustrating. And this shows up as perfectionism, the desire to be at the same level of proficiency in this topic as they have been in other topics. I run into this a little bit with art, if I'm being honest. When I approach music, it comes very, very naturally for me. And so I often jump into art things and like, why can't I figure out how to draw this human face from memory after trying 6 times? Well, that's not normal, but I have an area in my life where proficiency comes much more easily for me. And so I'm frustrated when I don't think about it too deeply that art doesn't come as easily for me as music does. Now, I'm also not being realistic or gracious to myself because the ludicrous amount of time that I spent with music in high school massively outweighs the amount of time that I put into art. And so obviously that skill set is more highly developed. But we also have things that come naturally to us and things that don't. Art didn't come naturally for me. I'm still working on building up skills. It's still hard. I still struggle sometimes and wear myself out when I sit down to practice. Music is usually stress relieving. So if you have had a lot of areas in your life, or even just a select few where things have come very easily for you, it can be easy to be perfectionistic when you approach your artwork, because it feels like you should succeed just as quickly as you did on other things. If this is you, this is potentially one of the easier ones to deal with, because it's the knowledge of that that's going to help you start moving through it. It's not going to be easy to deal with, but it's a little bit easier to gain that perspective, to understand, oh, it's okay, I've got other areas where I'm really proficient. This one's going to take a while. I need to sidle into it. I need to understand that it's going to take me some time and find a way to enjoy that process. So what can you do to fight your perfectionistic tendencies? Right out of the gate, I think it's important to be careful about labeling yourself a perfectionist. Whether you have come to this term or people in your life have allocated it for you, it's really important to think about what that means, about this label that is being applied to you. If you throw yourself into the box of being a perfectionist, it comes with certain connotations. It can be a way for you to allow yourself to get away with certain things. I did this thing that I shouldn't have, but it's because I'm a perfectionist. Labels like this are not always a positive thing for us, and especially as artists, they can be detrimental. It can lead to defeatist ideas. The idea that this is the way I am, I'm stuck here, I can't change it, it's part of my label and my identity. It's difficult when you identify as a thing to then do anything that is contrary to that. So if this perfectionistic tendency is pulling you down, it's not aiding you in any way, it's making your life more miserable, then try to detach yourself from the label. Try to think about yourself as a person who struggles with perfectionism. As a label, it's not a particularly positive one. It's not something that gets thrown out very positively, except in maybe high school circles where you talk about the kid who became the valedictorian and everyone throws out the term, oh, well, they're such a perfectionist, and they wear it as a badge of honor, but we've all seen videos and heard speeches about valedictorians who wish they would have put more time into things other than just their academics, so I think that's a pretty thin veneer. If you let yourself believe you are, have always been, and will always be a perfectionist, you're going to allow yourself to continue doing things that are harmful for you. And it's going to be a label that other people are going to continue tossing your way as well. So be careful about the label. Consider thinking of yourself as a person who struggles with perfectionism. Next, be aware of your tendencies and seek to understand yourself better. You are the only person you will always be stuck with, so get to know yourself. If you have these tendencies, you can expect them. You can know that they're going to come up when you start doing something new. And especially if they're triggered by new activities, new artistic media, you can know going into watercolor for the first time that it's going to upset the perfectionistic components of your personality. So be aware of those things. And work toward liking yourself. It goes a long way toward enjoying life and benefiting from life. Remember that perfectionistic tendencies are likely unproductive. If you lean perfectionistically, you likely desire to achieve much. So try shifting your mindset. Remind yourself that this is actually hindering your progress. Your mental state that desires progress hinders progress. Now, this might be a more difficult thing for those that struggle to control and command their emotions and their state of being, their perspective on things. But it's a skill worth working on. If you can shift your perspective to understand that your desire to execute everything perfectly and to hold yourself to these excruciatingly high standards is actually shooting yourself in the foot, then you might be able to work backward from that and realize and change your perspective daily to one that is a little bit more healthy. If you truly desire to grow, to learn new things, and to progress in all of these areas, then being a perfectionist is not going to assist you. It's going to potentially hold you to a standard where you are going to achieve more, but your joy is going to diminish. And with your joy diminishing, it's going to be harder for you to stick to your art for the long term. I've had a lot of students over the years that held themselves to very, very high standards, and what they often ran into is they would work very, very, very hard for short periods of time, and then they would collapse. They would enter periods of artistic burnout or creative block. And these things seem to turn up far more for people who struggle with perfectionism. Those who aren't worried about perfectionistic tendencies often don't have these large periods of artistic block or creative block. They're able to continue producing at whatever rate they do for a much longer time, it seems. Remember again that art cannot be perfect. It takes lots of time, and you're just like everyone else. You aren't a failure because it's taking you more than a year to learn how to draw in perspective. Some people struggle to learn how to do anything artistically or musically for a very long amount of time. I've heard a lot of people, including Marshall Vandruff and Stan Prokopenko, talk about how it realistically takes about 5 years to learn drawing and about 10 years to learn how to draw well. I hate hearing those numbers because it always feels like that's such an excruciatingly long quantity of time. But if I look back on my own artistic progress, on the fact that I started drawing in earnest in elementary school, I did a lot of it in middle school, I didn't do a lot in any formal sense in the beginning of my high school career. I formalized it at the end of my high school career. I went to school for it, and then I taught for 11 years. If I'm to take all the time out of there, I probably have, 7 to 11 years worth of actual daily art progress and practice. I would like to say that I have 25 or so, but it's probably just not true, because there have been big periods of time where I haven't done a whole lot artistically. I'm fortunate in that I taught art, and so even the days where I wasn't drawing, I was working with people's drawings, and so my eyes are really, really good. This leads to a struggle for me personally, where my eyes are able to pick out things that are wrong in my pieces, and my hands and my brain are not capable of actually rectifying the issues. So that's a little bit stressful, and it's a unique problem that I have, although most artists, usually our eyes improve faster than our ability to actually execute a thing. Think of this as well. If you were actually as good as your mentors or your idols, you would still find things to be dissatisfied with in your art. Even the greatest artists in our world see mistakes in their own work. They know what they want to accomplish next. They know where they want to go. They know what they want to improve. Even people that are so insanely good that it feels like we will never hit those echelons, they are still finding imperfections in their own work. So we may be on a lower tier of the pyramid compared to the greats, but no one reaches the top of the pyramid. We're all on the same journey. We're just at different places on the pyramid and probably different sides of it, and I'm just hoping that I'm not still on the sand. Try setting goals and measuring yourself against those goals instead of letting your subconscious run with comparisons and perfectionism. So I've talked about this a lot in a lot of my videos. I think setting goals and sticking to them is one of the best things you can do for any creative medium. For my writing, my goal is 700 to 1,000 words a day on my novel, and that's really easy to hold to. Now, I don't have a clear date for when I finish the thing. I don't have a clear idea of what that writing is every day. Sometimes that writing is outlines, and it's just pulling apart ideas and what I want to do with it. Artistically, I have goals every week. I have to produce things for my videos, I have to produce things for Instagram, and I don't always meet my goals. Frequently, I don't. In fact, I usually set my standards about 10% higher than what I can do, but I'm kind of okay with achieving 3/4 of what I set out to do. So if I try to do 5 or 6 gouache paintings in a week and I only get 4, I'm like, that's okay. I painted this week. If I set it too high, or if my goal is to do it every single day, it becomes difficult, and then I'll fall behind. And when I fall behind, it's like, well, what's the point? So set realistic goals for yourself, goals that will help you tether yourself to constant work. And then when you feel perfectionistic, you can look at those and be like, no, I have gotten 16 sketchbooks filled in the last 2 years, and I have continued. That would be a lot of sketchbooks. I have gotten into my sketchbook every day this week. I've written a little bit every day this week. I've written a little bit 5 days this week, whatever. But set goals that make sense, compare yourself to those, and evaluate yourself based on those. That's a little bit easier and a little bit more rational than looking at a piece and being like, I'm a failure because this didn't turn out well. That's kind of an amorphous thing. It's hard to understand what that actually means, and it's just not a fair tool to evaluate yourself with. Try very hard to avoid procrastination. So procrastination and perfectionism work against our time in opposite ways. Procrastination eats away at how much time we have available to complete whatever the thing is, and perfectionism increases the amount of time the project takes. A lot of people who struggle with perfectionism also struggle with procrastination. The problem is they do the same thing to us on opposite fronts. So they both hurt us, and they hurt us in the same exact way. So if you struggle with perfectionism, try very, very hard to avoid procrastinating. It is going to eliminate the amount of time that you have to work, and then your perfectionistic tendencies are going to freak out, and it's not going to be pleasant for you or for anyone around you. So be careful. I know it's a difficult thing to say, just don't procrastinate, and I will probably do a podcast on procrastination at some point because it's such a huge part of artists in general, but try as hard as you can not to give in to procrastination. Well, I hope this has been beneficial for you. It is a difficult topic to talk about, one that so many of us struggle with, and I hope that it's been beneficial to you in some way. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. I would love for you to check out some of the other podcasts as well if this was helpful for you. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.